Hello friends, how are you? I'm Ari Thurger, and today I'm going to answer a question posed by one of my patrons, Mr. Dean Campbell. And the question is if women go to Valhalla. Now, before we start this video, perhaps the previous video entitled Viking Men Were Also Housewives might help you out, giving a general panorama from the archaeological point of view, of course, and the reality of Viking Age graves concerning both men and women. If you haven't watched that video yet, I suggest that you do it, because it may help you out to better understand the content of this one and the question of gender roles that perhaps, or maybe not, noticeable in the archaeological record of the Viking Age, which certainly reflects the mentality of medieval Scandinavians, and their mentality, reflected in the way they treated their dead, obviously gives us some hints of the afterlife panorama, which is what we are going to focus on this video today. So, on that video, I present you, I think, an important point about the burials in Viking Age Scandinavia, and you will understand that there isn't a lot of differences on the material culture found in graves for both men and women of certain classes, which indicates their resting place and or afterlife was the same, and there wasn't a clear distinction, which is equally important to understand the concept of Valhalla itself and the afterlife panorama in general in Old Norse religion, before the introduction of Abrahamic religious concepts. Ah yes, I've noticed you staring at this, you have keen eyes. You have probably figured out what it is already. Indeed, by the middle of this video, I have something for you, so stick around. Now, let's get started. Speaking of Abrahamic religious concepts, without a doubt, if you have tried to search for the answer on the question, did women go to Valhalla or what was their afterlife place, you might have come to a point in which it is said that Helgafell was the place in the afterlife where women went to. Now, Helgafell is the Holy Mountain, and it is a small mountain in the Snæfellsnes Peninsula of Iceland. A real landmark which was very important for the first Icelandic settlers. In the sagas, it is mentioned the construction of a temple to Thor on top of this mountain, Helgafell. Thor, was the most worshipped deity during the Viking Age, and his cult didn't stop with the first Icelandic settlers. If anything, it only augmented. There are some connections, indeed, between Thor and the cult of the dead. The extent of his worship in the north was far greater than any other deity, perhaps second only to Freyr. The mark of the swastika, or the hammer on cremation urns and memorial stones, suggests that Thor provided his protection to his worshippers in the realm of death as well as in the realm of life. So building a temple to Thor on Helgafell, it's a good indicator of this natural feature being linked to the cult of the dead. Now, one example. The Christian Icelandic settler Audr Jofudga, a woman, according to the sagas, she made her home near Helgafell, and following her death, her kinsmen worshipped these hills. And then sacrifices began. A pagan temple was indeed built there. They believed they would go into the hills when they died. Instead of referring to the gates of heaven, the Landmabok employs the image of the sacred hill, Helgafell, as the gateway to the afterlife. And this tradition was restricted to Thor worship, since the Odinic cult would place the dead in Odin's Valhalla and not Helgafell. Thor's followers in Iceland expected their souls to be transported to Helgafell, whereas Odin's warriors expect to go to Valhalla after dying in battle. But it must be pointed out that the soul wasn't a concept within the religious beliefs of pagan Scandinavians. So when you see in the sagas a clear detachment between body and soul, it is already a Christian conception or perception. And indeed, in this particular case, Haldr's kinsmen, most were Christians. So obviously they believed their spirit, their soul, would go into Helgafell. In pre-Christian Scandinavia, the belief was that both the spirit and the whole physical body would go to the afterlife place, hence burying or cremating the dead and placing their ashes in sacred or holy grounds. Now, another example. One woman whose spirit is believed to dwell in Helgafell is Gudrun Osfursdottir, Iceland's first hermit nun. According to the Lixdila saga, the heroine Gudrun Osfursdottir supposedly was buried here in Helgafell. So this is another example that women, perhaps those of great renown, would be buried on this holy mountain. During the time of the still pagan settlers, the mountain was indeed seen or said to be the home for dead people. There are a number of accounts reflecting superstitious attitudes towards the mountain. For instance, not looking at the mountain before washing as a sign of respect towards the ancestors living inside Helgafell. A couple of other accounts specifically mentions the dead going into the mountain to live inside it in great halls. When Christianity came to Iceland, Helgafell remained a place of worship, but Christian churches replaced pagan temples. This provided a new savior for people who refused to continue worshipping Thor. The pagan conceptions linked to Helgafell were replaced by Christian religious conceptions, but the mountain remained a holy place. So, when it comes to the Norse myths and the conception of the afterlife, it's easy to point out that the afterlife for women was Helgafell, given the previous examples. However, Helgafell is a place name in the western part of Iceland, and during pagan times the concept of this natural feature being a place of the afterlife at most was a local belief around that area, but absolutely not for pagans in general. So Helgafell is by no means the only afterlife place for women or the place to where women went after death. The concept of Helgafell did not exist before Norwegians settled in Iceland for the very first time and came in contact with these hills. Certainly, Helgafell wasn't even a concept back in the continent until Icelandic sources reached the continent. Icelandic sagas probably influenced oral tradition in the continent and storytelling, which led to the perception of a belief that the deceased in pagan Scandinavian tradition would go to a local mountain. This is a very late concept of afterlife, exclusive from a local area in Iceland, and without a doubt Christian influence on the area, both religious conceptions and physical influences by building churches on top of the old pagan temples, influenced even more the concept of afterlife being a holy mountain. Now, this doesn't mean that before Christian influences, people did not believe that the dead would inhabit a mountain. In fact, as we can see from the archaeological record, old Germanic peoples as a whole, and much of prehistoric Europeans for that matter, at least since the Neolithic, believed that the dead would indeed inhabit hills and mountains. But the pagan concept in here isn't specifically focused on geographical features of great relevance, but instead focused on the belief that the dead would go to the underworld, which is virtually everything beneath our feet. the focus on a holy mountain to where the dead go and as an afterlife place is exclusively, well, mainly in this case, an Abrahamic religious conception. In the case of Scandinavia, a conception created by Christian Icelanders. So, where did women go after death? I'll answer that question in a few minutes, but before that, let me show you something. So, my dear friends, just a little pause to show you this bracelet VK and G Jewelry sent me. I confess I've been bothering them to send me this one, which I think it's quite beautiful. I have a thing for snakes, serpents, as you have probably noticed by now. Now, let's go to what really matters. I have a code for you, which I leave right here. Use it to have 30% discount on the whole store from this day, the 27th of November, until tomorrow, the 28th, obviously. So hurry up, my good friends, a gift for a gift, and of course, enjoy it. So, where did women go after death? A lot of Viking-era graves indicate that they were constructed as if the graves were the eternal staying place of the deceased. Again, I suggest you watch my previous video about Viking Age graves of both men and women. A woman, as well as a man, would likely go where most dead went, into the mound, which would turn into a sacred ground and associated with the family, the ancestors, nature and local spirits. The concept of the Alfar, elves, starts off precisely as ancestral spirits residing in the burial mounds that became land spirits, spirits to whom people sacrificed and made all sorts of offerings. The first elves were ancestral spirits, who became spiritual entities capable of having a very active influence upon the land they inhabited, which was the burial mound, and, of course, an active influence upon their descendants, who still made sacrifices to such spirits. Which is why many private plots, sacrifices, were performed on top or around or near the burial mounds within the farmland of a specific family. And it was the family's duty to continue to praise, worship, sacrifice to those ancestral spirits. These Alfar, elves, or Landveithir, or whites in general. Now, the dead would also go to the realm of hell. Absolutely everyone went to hell, as I've expressed on the video about going down to hell. Please, if you have the time, do watch that one. According to the sources, it didn't matter who you were, your social status, gender, or anything else. Everyone ended up going to hell. And once in that realm, they would be sorted out to their rightful places. In earlier conceptions of hell, it was simply the realm of the dead, all the dead, which gives us the impression that all the other hulls as afterlife places, including Valhalla itself, originally were situated in hell because it was simply the realm of the dead and where every hull related to the acceptance of specific dead was indeed situated in hell. Hell is also related to the concept of the burial mound, as I've explained on the video about Naustrond, which reinforces what we find in the archaeological record concerning the pre-Christian conceptions of the afterlife, that the grave or burial mound was indeed the eternal staying place of the dead, and that from there they would either pass on into the earth and become spirits of place, Landveithir, Olfar, Dwergar, etc., or would pass on into hell, the underworld, which was perceived as being literally the earth beneath our feet. The underworld and the realm of the dead, right there, underground. Women as well as men would go down to hell. There were no distinctions of gender or social status. Absolutely everyone went to hell. However, once in there, distinctions were indeed made when it was time to sort out the dead into their rightful places. But distinctions weren't based on gender, but on social status and on the manner in which a person had died. Valhalla, was said to be the resting place of the warrior aristocracy and other warlike followers of Odin, both those who died in battle and those who sacrificed themselves or were killed in the name of Odin, either via strangulation or hanging, followed by being stabbed. Valhalla was not a heavenly place, as portrayed by Snorri Sturluson and other literary works composed during the 13th century and during the Catholic period of Iceland. The conception of Valhalla before Christian influences was very clear. All those who died in the battlefield would go to Valhalla. It always involves falling in battle. Either Valhalla or Helgafell, where Freyja's halls, Sesrumnir, lie. Nothing is specifically mentioned about gender. A person would go into Valhalla or Helgafell if they died on the battlefield. And the choices between these two places depends on the Valkyries, that in turn follow the orders of either Odin or Freya. After death, ending up in one of these two places of the afterlife, for the warrior class, depends on who Odin and Freya choose to take from the dead on the battlefield. In pre-Christian Scandinavian religious conceptions, Valhalla was by no means the main destination in the afterlife. First, people would go to hell, to the realm of the dead, and only then, in there, they would be sorted out to their rightful places, according to their social status and the manner in which they had died. Valhalla was for warriors who died in the battlefield, and later on it was added to the very concept of Valhalla itself that those who were sacrificed in the name of Odin, being strangled or hanged in the process of sacrificing, would go to Valhalla because they were being sacrificed to Odin, human offerings to Odin. Therefore, they would end up in the afterlife place where Odin presided. Odin in pre-Christian Scandinavia was by no means the main god except for poets. Ordinary people worshipped Thor, Freyr, Freya, Njordr, and even Tyr. And even before the Viking period, pre-Viking, there must have been a tremendous worship of the god Huldr, judging by the great amount of place names derived from Uldr. And also in Scandinavia there are more place names derived from Vanir deities than all the other place names derived from all the other gods combined. The great majority of the pre-Viking Scandinavian populations were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and such other people not belonging to the aristocracy. With the Viking Age and the increasing numbers of warriors, Valhalla became a much more famous concept. Odin also became quite famous by the end of the Viking period, and with Christian influences upon literature, portraying Odin as the All-Father and King of the Gods, to create a parallel with the Christian God. And the whole story of Ragnarok gained more relevance precisely during the Catholic period to create parallels with the Christian apocalypse, that conception. We simply don't know how common the belief in Ragnarok was during pre-Christian Scandinavia. The conception of Valhalla being the main afterlife place and to where warriors go to train for the final battle during Ragnarok are later conceptions created by Christians and greatly fermented by pop culture. Furthermore, the idea of the violent death and the figure of a constantly raiding Viking who lived a warrior's life hoping to die in battle to go to Valhalla is in fact a literature phenomenon. Pre-Christian Scandinavians mostly were farmers and hunters and fishermen and craftsmen, and their seafaring was mostly about trading. The almost sickening obsession with the afterlife is a Christian religious attitude, which during the Middle Ages was absolutely focused on saving one's life and soul to acquire a place in the heaven. During the early Middle Ages, Christians were absolutely concerned with only living a life in a way that would ensure their place in heaven. So when we start to see a great emphasis on the afterlife on the Old Norse literary works, that emphasis is due to Christian conceptions rooted on a society which was already 200 years, at least, culturally far from the pagan past. In other words, Christians were pretty hooked up on the afterlife, so to speak. That was the big thing for them, the point of everything actually. And it is important to them, to Christians, to live their lives dedicated to the right afterlife. There are no reasons to assume that the afterlife was as important to pre-Christian Scandinavians as it was to Christians themselves. Nordic pagans believed in an afterlife, of course. There is no dispute, there is no doubt about that. But it was probably not as much the focal point of their religious practices. So, where did women go after death in pre-Christian Scandinavian religious conceptions? To hell, like everybody else. But the question is, could they have been accepted in Valhalla? Yes, they could have, provided that they had died on the battlefield. But most likely Valhalla was a concept of aristocracy for the warlike nobility. Therefore it wasn't an afterlife for the common warrior, but for the chieftain, warlord, king and queen, nobility in general. The great majority of the common folk expected to go to the afterlife where Thor presided. Women in pre-Viking times in Scandinavia most likely became the ancestral mothers, those spirits from which the concept of Valkyries originally came from. Please watch my video about Valkyries as the Norns of death. Many women after death most likely actually became what we would later call Valkyries, which were originally ancestral mothers, protective spirits. So, we have come to an end. I hope you have enjoyed this video and that it was useful somehow. Thank you so much for the question, Mr. Dean Campbell. And don't forget to visit the website VKNG Jewelry and use your promotional code. You will have 30% discount on the whole store for at least 24 hours. Enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, tack för det.